This morning, we are in Mark 11 and 12. We're kind of loosely, we have 8 weeks to cover 16 chapters, and so we have 2 more weeks after this. And then we will be done with Mark. Not done with Mark, but we will have surveyed Mark, and we'll never be done with Mark. But, you know, in terms of the chronology in the life of Christ, if you look at the 3.5 years of his ministry, we're now down to the last week of his life. And the Tuesday of this week, which is covered here, is the most detailed day in his public ministry. There are more verses devoted to the Tuesday of the last week of his life than any other day in his life. In fact, in the book of Matthew, 1 out of 6 verses in Matthew deals with one day, Tuesday. And so we're going to cover Tuesday. We have the triumphal entry on Sunday, and then the cleansing of the temple on Monday, and then you hit Tuesday, and it's a day of tremendous controversy. And so, and part of the controversy I have on the other side of the board here. You know, part of the controversy that Jesus is involved with and has been for his total ministry is the difference in covenants. In the Old Testament, it was a land covenant. In Christ, you have a spiritual covenant. And sometimes we don't grasp how radical Jesus was and what he was telling people and what he was introducing to them. For example, you know, God called Abraham 1,000 miles from where his original home, and then from Ur to Haran and down to where he was. And so he traveled as God had led him. He promised him. Good morning, Mrs. Allen. Okay. She brings neighbor kids, so it's sometimes. And so he has promised land, every place where you place your foot. And basically, you're looking at 150 miles to 70 miles wide, what we call the Holy Land. So he was promised the land, and all of the promises dealt with the land. If you obey my commandments and do everything I say, you won't have the diseases that other nations have around you. Your enemies will not invade you. The rain will fall. And in other words, it was all tied to the land. It was a land covenant. And in that covenant, there were sacred places. What was a sacred place under the old covenant? What? Temple, sacred place, you know, up on Mount Zion there, Mount Moriah, where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. So you have sacred places. Are there sacred places in the new covenant? No, there are no sacred places except your heart. You know, that's a sacred place, but there were sacred objects what were some of the sacred objects under the old covenant? The Ark of the Covenant. All the utensils in the temple that they used, you know, all those things had to be handled right. They didn't handle the Ark of the Covenant correctly one time when David was moving it, and 2 people died. David got fed up, parked it at a farm, and he was irritated, you know, trying to do a good thing. But they hadn't handled it correctly. There were sacred objects. Are there sacred objects under the new covenant? No. There's a lot of Old Testament thinking in what we would call supposedly New Covenant churches. For example, they have sacred things. We call this, sometimes I don't say we call, but a lot of times we'll call it the sanctuary. You know, you can't do things in here that you can do in fellowship hall, right? Kids can run around fellowship hall. They can't run around in here, you know. You can drink coffee in fellowship hall. You cannot drink it in here. In other words, we say we don't have sacred places, but yeah, we have some places that are a little more sacred than others. You have, under the Old Covenant, sacred people. You had different classes of people. Yes, Alex?
If God is everywhere, and God is in me, the Holy Spirit is in me, so wherever I am, God is with me, so wherever God is sacred. So
Right, like I said, right, the sacred places are our hearts now. It's our hearts. There were sacred people. There was a set apart class of people that were sacred people. They were the priest and the priesthood and Aaron. And so they were a different class. They went to God for you. You know, they were the ones that were the mediators there. And in the new covenant, we're all sacred, right? We all are a royal priesthood. Under the Old Covenant, they had yearly feast. You know, it was based upon the agricultural calendar. They had these feasts. And on the other side on that calendar, you know, Jesus attended the Feast of Tabernacles, the Passover, the Feast of Dedication. I mean, Jesus, by the way, was a Jew, if you don't remember. He was born under the Old Covenant, died under the Old Covenant. You know, so he was under the Old Covenant. He fulfilled the Old Covenant. And there were yearly feasts, and the longest calendar in the New Covenant that we see is the weekly feast, the Lord's Supper, right? Yeah, we have, what are some of our annual feasts that Christians celebrate? Christmas, Easter, things like that. But under the New Covenant, there was really, the longest calendar in the New Covenant was 7 days. That was it, you know, the first day of every week. And so Jesus grew up under this, but he introduced something totally, radically different. And so sometimes we do not appreciate, and we get caught up in our minds. We have Old Covenant thinking, although we're New Covenant people. For example, there's a verse of Scripture they use on usually National Prayer Day, that if my people will return to me, I will heal their land and all this. It's a nice verse, but it had nothing to, it was a land covenant verse. It was tied to the land. You obey the laws, everything will be okay in the land. You don't obey the laws, you'll be carried to captivity, the locust will come. Remember is it Joel that has the invasion of the locust? And God promises them if they return to him, he will give them the years the locusts have eaten. And so we don't live under an old covenant. Even under the old covenant, the land had to have a Sabbath rest. 7 years and in the year of Jubilee. In other words, in fact, when they didn't let the land rest, that was part of the reason they went into captivity for 70 years in Babylon. And so we live under and so Jesus is going to be in conflict with the Jewish leaders, because as Mark Twain once said, the Pharisees were good people in the worst sense of the term. And so they became caricatures of what God wanted. We don't live under the old covenant. We have no sacred places. We don't have sacred people. We're all sacred. We don't have any sacred objects. And there are a lot of Orthodox, Catholic, and different denominations that have sacred things, icons, statues, relics of the bones of the saints, all of these kind of things that supposed to be sacred. But that's old covenant. That has nothing to do with what Jesus introduced. And it also affects worship. We don't have time to talk about that, but his idea of worship, I think sometimes we have an Old Testament sense of worship, and we haven't totally grasped what he said. So we come back to Jesus, and on Sunday he has a triumphal entry in Mark chapter 11. We're familiar with that. He goes in, and when he gets into town in verse 11, he entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, and since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. His pattern all week long is going to be in town during the daytime, out of town at night. That's why they couldn't catch him. That's why they needed a traitor. That's why they needed Judas, because they weren't sure where he was going to be, because he did not stay inside the walls of the city. They couldn't arrest him in the daytime. He was too popular with the people, and there'd be a riot. And the one thing they wanted to avoid was the Roman garrisons rushing into the temple area and trying to end a riot. And so they had to catch him outside of the temple, someplace where, and so at night, every night, he left town. I'm sure they had people trying to figure out where he was. And that's why they finally said, well, we'll just get an insider. Judas Iscariot. He'll tell us where he's going to be so that we can get this done. And so he comes back on Monday in verse 12. And by the way, we have the cursing of the fig tree. If you read read Mark this week, how many of you were puzzled by the cursing of the fig tree? Some. You were, Richard, you're puzzled by it. It's one of the most puzzling and criticized events in the life of Christ. He was mean to the pigs, earlier, in chapter 6, where he sent the demons into 2,000 pigs, ran and died. People have trouble. Peter has trouble with that. What in the world is Jesus doing, with these pigs? Now he's cursing a fig tree. And they don't think it's the fig tree's fault to begin with at all. And he curses it in the way into town, and the next day they come back by and on Tuesday, and it's withered. And Peter says to him in verse 21, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed is withered." Now, what was the point that Jesus was making in the cursing of the fig tree? By the way, the fig tree wasn't supposed to have fruit for a couple more months. But the fruit begins to bud before the leaves come out, so you have the leaves, this thing is totally leaved out. So it should have some fruit on it. Maybe it's in a little micro environment there, and something like that. And it was an early, and also, most of the time, there was still old fruit from the year before hanging around. He couldn't see any fruit. No old fruit, no new buds, nothing. It was taking up space. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. And so he said, well, you're taking up space. Nobody was ever going to eat from this tree. That's it. What is the parable? In other words, if this is, in a sense, a living parable that he is giving them, what is the point of the parable?
And I think it's saying that it's referring to Christians being productive. And Christians, we're not supposed to be on the season. Not what we produce.
All right. There weren't Christians yet, but yeah, for us, what would have been the parable to them in their day? It's a faith lesson. He says that if you had faith in God, you could throw this Mount of Olives into the sea and it would go. In other words, what did he do on Monday? He cleansed the temple, right? He went in there. He did it at the beginning of his ministry when he started way down here, and he does it at the end of his ministry. He goes into the temple and he cleanses it. In other words, he pushes out the money changers and the animals and all that. And it really bugged Jesus, because It was in the court of Gentiles. They had inner and outer courts. You got the court of Gentiles, you got the court of women, you got the court of Israel, and then you have the temple proper itself. And so the Gentiles were only allowed in this outer ring. And that's where they carried on selling postcards and everything else, in other words, and you know, all the things that they would have done. And so anybody seeking God that wasn't a Jew came in and saw this chaos that looked like Buc-ee's, okay? Have you been to Buc-ee's? We went to Buc-ee's for the first time, and I was overwhelmed. I looked around here and I thought, this is worse than Disneyland. I mean, you know, it was, and I worked at Disneyland when I was in college. I mean, I looked around at this thing and I thought, good night, the people and the crowds, and I said, my goodness. So it looked like Buc-ee's. Well, somebody seeking God, they come in there and there's chaos going on, and Jesus said that's the only chance non-Jews have to find out about Jehovah, and look what they've done here. So he kicked them all out. And Annas, the high priest, according to Josephus, an early historian, said that it was called Annas's Bazaar. In other words, he owned the franchise there. They were making money in the temple. You show up with your money you come from other countries, and Cyprus or Syria, and you can use the temple shekel. So you have you have to exchange money there, and they're making money on the rate of exchange. They're making money on the animals. You didn't bring an animal. You weren't going to haul an animal the whole way, so you got to buy a lamb. It's the Passover. So, you know, the lambs were very expensive. In other words, they were making money. So Jesus, he goes in there, right to the heart of the high priest's family, because they own the franchise, and he overturns the tables and kicks the animals out, and, you know, it's just total chaos. He goes right at them, head on. You know, there wasn't anything subtle about this. The difference between this and in the beginning, in John, when he cleans the temple, or in the beginning of his ministry, he didn't make a whip in this one. In the first one, he made a whip and whipped them. Here, he just went in there and he just turned tables and drove everybody out. And they pretty much thought this is a wild man, and so everybody got out of his way. Plus, he was very popular. They knew who he was, and so nobody was going to confront him, not here. Because you have to remember, at the temple compound, if you were looking at the temple, up in the northwest corner is a tower, and there is a fortress that the Romans manned right there. They had garrisons and troops right there. Because if there's going to be trouble with the Jews, it's going to be during one of these festivals when you've got several 100,000 people in there. And so they had their troops right there. And so I'm sure that once there was chaos going on in the court of the Gentiles there, the outer court, I'm sure the troops were on high alert that something's going on here. So they probably didn't want to confront Jesus too much, the temple guard or anybody else, because if there's fighting that broke out, those troops were going to be in there, and the Romans didn't mess around. They took care of business, so they're going to clean it out. And so they didn't want to start a riot. And so Jesus cleans the temple, and then he curses the fig tree. What happens if you're unproductive? You're spiritually no fruit. That was his message to the Jewish leaders. And that was his message to his men as they were walking in and out of town. He said, they're like a fig tree with no fruit. They're just taking up space. And Alex, like you said, for us as Christians, we don't want to be people who just take up space, right? And don't have any fruit. In fact, if you look over in John, turn over to the Gospel of John in chapter 15. In John chapter 15, very, very familiar passage of Scripture about vine and the branches. And Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that what? Bears no fruit, right? While every branch that does bear fruit, he leaves alone and says, well done. Is that what yours said? No. He prunes it so it can be more fruitful. Now let me get this right, Jesus. If I don't bear fruit, you're going to take me off the vine. And if I do bear fruit, you're going to prune me? Yep. Why? So you can bear more fruit. How many of you have been pruned? How might God prune us? Excuse me?
Consequences of poor choices.
Yeah, we can make poor choices, and we can prune ourselves. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes, has God ever allowed things into your life that you didn't plan for and didn't want? How about some illnesses? Did anybody ever raise their hand and say, Lord, I'll take cancer. I'll take that. Can I? No. But things happen, right? You get a diagnosis that you were not expecting. You go into your job and they've eliminated your position. And you're doing a good job, but you don't have a job now. There's all kind of things that God allows. By the way, if you are a Christian, that's an umbrella, okay? Not a very good one. If you are a Christian, you are living under God's protection, under His umbrella of protection. Nothing comes your way that doesn't come from His love and for your good. And sometimes what He says is good for you, you wouldn't choose. Right? Remember that the God that, for Christians, the God that we pray to heal someone of cancer is the same God who allowed cancer to come to that person. There was a reason that God allowed it. It wasn't that He doesn't. He says He counts every hair on your head. Oh, quit laughing at me. He knows. Yeah, we make God's job a little easier. How much detail is God concerned in your life? He knows how, He counts, He knows how many hairs on your head. I was reading in the book of Psalms in my own devotion this week, and it says He names all the stars. Look up in a sky at night and look at the millions of stars, and God has named them all. He knows. He's totally involved in your life. And as a Christian, if something happens to you, it's not like, okay, God, hurry up and catch up here. I'm at this intersection. Something's happened. Get up here and help me. He was at the intersection before you got there. And He says that every branch that bears fruit, He trims or prunes it clean so it'll be even more fruitful. And so when you go back to the cursing of the fig tree, it is a theme that we see in Jesus several times about pruning and being fruitful. He also used a fig tree earlier in a parable that wasn't bearing fruit, and they gave it 3 years, and if it didn't shape up, it was going to tear it out and plant something else. I often think I had a neighbor named Wally Nelson, and he lived behind me, and I lived in Olympia, Washington, and he planted this apple tree on the side, and he babied that apple tree. I mean, it was probably about, he bought it at some nursery, and it was probably 6 feet tall, and he had that thing, and he went out there all the time and was fertilizing it and doing everything, and this went on for a couple of years. So one day, he said, when do they get apples? I said, I don't know. I mean, we lived in Washington. They have apples, but they're all in Yakima, I mean, they have a Washington State apple. I said, I don't know when they have apples. So when I was at the store, I had some small apples, so I took them and I dropped them in his yard. And I watched him because I could look out my back door and I could see him over there in his side yard. And I knew about what time he came out, and I saw him out there, and he had a hose and all that. And then I see him, he's looking, and he goes down and he picks these up, and he's looking at the tree, and he was so excited that it finally had fruit. He didn't speak to me for about a week after that. He thought that was mean, but I thought it was funny. But bearing fruit. Do you bear fruit for Jesus? If everybody was involved in the church at the level that you're involved, would there be a church at all? See, a lot of people have a decapitated Jesus. They like the head, but not the body. They say, Jesus, yes. Church, no. So they just decapitated him. They like the head, but they don't like the body. The only instrument that Jesus established to save a lost world is what? The church. You can say, well, you don't have to have a church to go tell somebody the gospel. Okay, they become a Christian, then what are you going to do? You got to teach them, right? You end up having a church. You end up having to meet, helping them grow. The only instrument that Jesus established to save a lost world is a church. And the only institution he established to mature and disciple people is the church. And so I'm sure Jesus shakes his head sometimes at people who say, I don't like the church. They're full of hypocrites. How many of you have doctors and nurses that are hypocrites, but you go to them anyway? I've watched nurses in my office where I work for a healthcare company, and I was on a second story, and all the nurses that smoked would gather outside and smoke. Were they hypocrites? I mean, we're working hospice and people with lung cancer, and they're out there smoking. It seems like you'd say, that's not a good idea. You know what I'm saying? But how many of you go to schools and have had instructors that were hypocrites, but you went anyway? I never had my kids when they say, we don't want to go to school, Dad, because the high school teachers are hypocrites. If they told me that, I'd say, I don't care, you're going anyway. And by the way, where do those hypocrites come from in the church? The world. From us. We can't get a better class of sinners. We get what we can take, right? See? So going back to Mark, the withered fig tree is a parable about being productive. And so then on Tuesday, the most detailed day in the life of Christ, more information of what happened on Tuesday. He's going to die on Friday. Tuesday is a big deal. We don't know what happened on Wednesday. It was a down day. And nothing is said. We know on Thursday we have the Last Supper and all of that, and Friday he dies. So Monday, he clears the temple. Sunday, he comes in and triumphal entry. Monday, he goes into the temple, looks around, causes chaos, leaves town, comes back on Tuesday, and it's the day when they bring all the big guns. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, all the different people that are after him, He spends all day in controversy with them. And that's what we have when you get down to verse 21. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, we're in Mark 11:27. The chief priests and teachers of the law and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things?" They asked, "and who gave you the authority to do this?" You could only have accredited teachers in the temple. This guy had not gone to any of their accredited institutions. He was a carpenter. He was blue collar. He talked about seeds and farming and sawdust in your eye and, pruning trees. Who do you think you are? We've been to all of the Jewish universities here in town. We have the credentials. Look at all of the letters behind our names here. Who gave you the authority to do this? And Jesus asked him a question. Simple question. He said, okay, you guys are experts. Tell me about John the Baptist. Was he from God or not? Well, all the people believed he was from God. The religious leaders weren't so sure. So they said, well, they discussed it among themselves in verse 31. If we say he was not from heaven, the crowd's going to be all over us. So they said, I'll tell you what, we don't know. These are the accredited teachers. They don't know. Jesus said, well, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. We could talk about an ethical dilemma sometimes that we have of what happens when someone does not deserve the truth? You can say, well, when would that be? We have to remember that before World War II and during World War II, Christians were hiding Jews. Jews were being exterminated. They were being put in camps. Was it 6-7 million Jews that died in the Holocaust during World War II? Somebody knocks on your door. They say, we're looking for your neighbors. They're Jewish. You said, do you know where they are? You're hiding them in your house, in your attic. And you say, I don't know. That's not hypothetical. That went on. Were they right in lying? Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's for another discussion. But Jesus said, you guys, you don't appreciate the truth, so I'm not going to answer your question. And so we get to chapter 12, and he tells a parable that about and if you read chapter 12, because we only have 10 minutes, and I want to get to, I don't want to do this parable here. I want to go down to verse 13. And later, in chapter 12, verse 13, some of the Pharisees and Herodians were the loyalists. They were the party loyal to the Herod family, to the king. They weren't sympathetic to the Romans, although, they were sympathetic to the Jewish king. They were loyalists. And so you have the Herodians and you have the Pharisees. There, according to Josephus, there were about 6,000 Pharisees in the days of Jesus. And when you have several million people living there and you have 6,000, they carried a lot of weight. Probably 1 to 2 million people lived in what we would call the Holy Land at that time. And so they tried to catch Jesus in his words. They came to him and said, Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity, that you aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are, and you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? They didn't like Jesus, but they decided to flatter him, and then they're going to. And Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. They brought the coin, and he asked them, whose portrait is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And they were amazed. I'm amazed when I read that. You know, the simplicity of what Jesus just said there. You know, they're trying to trap him. They want to go tell the Romans this guy is trying to foment an insurrection here, and don't pay taxes. By the way, are we supposed to pay taxes? Yeah. Did Paul tell us in Romans to pay our taxes? Yeah. And they were paying taxes to who? A government that was persecuting them. So Jesus said, yeah, give the... And then the next one, they want to trap him. Now the Pharisees and Herodians take a shot at it. They lose. So now the Sadducees, another religious party, they were associated with the temple. They were the aristocracy. Who they didn't believe in the resurrection. And they came to him with a question, teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife with no children, the man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. That was in the Old Testament law. That because it was a land covenant, as I talked about, if you die, you have no heirs, you have no land, you have no stake. And so if your brother dies and he has no children, you have to marry his wife, and the first child they have carries his name and inherits his property. Now, there's only 2 records in the Old Testament of that ever taking place. One of them is very famous, Ruth. But by the days of Jesus, they didn't do that any more than they stoned people that committed adultery. You know, in the 8th chapter, you know, they said, Moses had to stone. They hadn't stoned anybody for adultery for centuries. And they hadn't practiced this where you... So anyway, now there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died leaving no children. And it was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too, and boy, she couldn't wait to die. I mean, after these 7 brothers, for crying out loud. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Boy, you can see the crowd. The smiles on their face. This is a funny story. You know, 7 brothers marrying this gal. None of them have any kids, so now the Sadducees that don't even believe in the resurrection are asking him, whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? To show how ridiculous Jesus is in all this. And Jesus replied, are you not in error because you do not, first of all, know the scriptures or the power of God? You guys have 2 problems. When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, about the dead rising, have you not read the book of Moses in the account of the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You're badly mistaken. In other words, God doesn't say, I was the God of them, but I am. In other words, they're still alive. And he says, when it comes to the resurrection, we're going to be like angels. Not we will be angels, but in the way that the angels don't multiply and have little angels. I know Cupid is funny and little baby angels. They don't do that. The angels are made by God as a class of, and God makes them, and every one of them he made individually, so to speak, and they don't have boy angels and girl angels and have little angels. I know Valentine's Day cards are kind of messed up because of that, but he says when you get to heaven, you're not gonna, you don't have to procreate, multiply and fill heaven. He said, we'll fill heaven. And you're not going to, there's no sex in heaven. You will be identity, you'll have an identity, you'll probably be a man or a woman. I mean, but as far as being married in heaven, you're not going to be married in heaven. I had a lady in hospice one time when her husband died, said, am I going to be married to my husband in heaven? And I knew she was a Christian lady. And I said, well, Jesus said no. She said, I don't want to go. I don't want to go then. And, well, you and God can sort that one out. But when it comes to, when you go to heaven, you're not going to be married. Marriage is for here, to multiply and fill the earth. You get to heaven, it isn't going to be that way. And you, like Jesus said, you will be like the angels in heaven. Now, one other thing that happens at the very end of the day, we got just 2 or 3 minutes here. He's been in conflict all day long. The Pharisees and Herodians, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees take another shot at him, and the scribes, the lawyers. And all day long, all he has done is argue and fight all day long in the temple. Finally, he goes 15 steps down into the court, what's called the court of women, where the 7 offering containers were. When people came in the temple, they put their offerings. Some were for widows, some for sacrifices in the temple. There were different boxes you put your money in. They're called the trumpets because they were shaped like trumpets. And you put your money in there, and Jesus has just had it. He steps out and goes down there, and he's sitting down resting. You don't want to fight with him anymore right now. And in verse 41, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Jesus is watching. He was watching what they were giving. Wait a minute, Jesus, that's nobody's business. Well, it's his business. All right, he was watching. Many rich people threw in large amounts. And you can imagine these big trumpet-shaped things when they drop a bag of money in, thump, or they poured the coins in. Wow, you know. Because remember, in their culture, it's a land covenant. When God blesses you, he blesses you materially, and the more money you have, the more righteous you are. But a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, does anybody get it? I've been fighting with it. Does anybody get this? Even my disciples, you know, they don't always get it. I mean, does anybody get this? Does anybody care about God and what he says? Does anybody love him? And all of a sudden, this widow comes in. She scurries over and she drops 2 little leptons. I have a lepton. This was minted about 100 BC and by Maccabean. The lepton was a little copper coin. And she puts in, she only has 2. And she's a widow. You know, she doesn't have anybody else. They aren't dual income here. And she puts them both in, and Jesus says, I tell you the truth, that poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. Jesus was pumped. She gets it. She gives it all to God. Like I said, I've thought, well, maybe it'd be more prudent to put 1 in and keep 1. You know, she's got to live. But she gave it all to God. Every bit. And after a day when they've been trying to trap him and fight with him all day long, it's this little widow that puts that little spark of light into his life. I'm sure in the New Jerusalem, when we all get to heaven, we sing those songs, you're going to see Jesus at some point talking to her. Thank you. Thank you that day. It was the most detailed day in my public ministry, the most conflicted day I had, and it was a little widow who put in all she had. Remember with Jesus, it's not what you give, it's what you keep for yourself. and she kept none of it. All right, next week we'll do chapters 13 and 14.